Welcome back to the channel, guys. This week we're going to do more of kind of a rapid fire Q&A to the first question. Rate of gain. What's the best rate of gain during an off season? So I think that a good general range to be in is around 1% of your body weight per month. Now, if you're a beginner and you're just starting out, you might have a little bit more room for growth there. So being a little bit above that might not be a bad idea. And if on the flip side, if you're more advanced and maybe you have a little bit less room to grow there, maybe you try to trickle that down just a little bit. But I think around 1% of your body weight per month for a lot of people is a good kind of place to be. All right. And keep in mind that it's not usually just linear. Some months you might gain 2%. Some months you might gain nothing. And that's okay. Over time, seeing about 1% increase over time is kind of what I think is a good range to shoot for. And question 2 is rate of loss. So instead of maybe 1% per month while we might see while gaining, I think about 0.5% to 1% per week while cutting is a good range of loss. And the leaner you are or the longer you've been cutting, you might want to err on maybe the slower end a little bit. So if you're already pretty lean, maybe you go towards around 0.5% of your body weight per week. But if you've kind of just getting into the diet, you've got quite a bit of adipose tissue to lose yet, losing about 1% per week is probably a good rate. And if we're losing much above that, we might start risking a little bit of muscle loss unless you are starting from a place of being quite overweight or it's just going to be a very short fat loss phase. Then maybe you start a little bit quicker. Also, I think that starting out a fat loss phase a little bit more aggressive around that 1% or even a little bit more might be a good idea to really get that ball rolling. And in the first week of your fat loss phase, don't worry about how much weight you lose and stuff like that. Like you might drop 2%, 3% of your body weight in that first week, just dropping water, glycogen, stuff like that. Don't worry about it. Just pay attention to your rate of loss once you're kind of through that first week. And also, if you really feel like you're in a deficit, you're in a deficit and the weight is just not cooperating, it might be a good idea to give it at least a couple of weeks looking at those weekly averages before making a change. And I have definitely had clients that they didn't lose a ton of weight over a single mesocycle, but their photos looked drastically different. So still paying attention to photos, how you're looking, and other measurements. I like a waist circumference to also kind of keep an eye on body fat. If you're looking better and your waist measurements are getting better, they're getting smaller, but your weight isn't moving a ton, well, our goal at the end of the day is to look better, most of our goals, not necessarily to just lose weight. So yes, I think a good general recommendation is shooting for 0.5% to 1% of your body weight per week. And the leaner you are, maybe the lower on that end you go, and vice versa for the less lean you are. But I also think it's important to pay attention to how you're actually looking, how your circumference measurements are doing, and other things like that, because weight doesn't always tell the full story, all right? Question number 3, what do I think about doing a mesocycle only of compound lifts? I think that doing isolation lifts is a good way to add a little bit extra low fatiguing stimulus. So you can kind of fill up your peripheral muscle group recoverable stimulus a little bit more by doing isolations. However, I still think a mesocycle of completely compounds can be quite effective, and I like seeing around 50+% of my exercises being mainly compound lifts. Now, if you're particularly wanting to grow your delts and your biceps and your arms and stuff like that, I think having some direct kind of isolation work for those muscle groups is probably a good idea for most people. Some people do barbell rows, bench press, and everything grows. But I think most people need a little bit of that direct work. So yes, a mesocycle of all compounds can absolutely be effective. However, I think that working in some isolations adds in some lower fatiguing stimulus and can definitely be a way to add a little bit more stimulus to muscles that aren't necessarily hit quite as much with compound lifts. Question number 4, more or less exercise variation with equal volume. What's going to lead to better outcomes? I think that as long as you stay away from the extremes, you're going to be fine, and I would expect similar outcomes either way. So as long as you're not doing like one exercise for all of your volume, I think that you're going to be pretty fine there. And I don't think that that's probably a good idea because we're not getting different like angles of pull to incorporate our full muscle group and that sort of thing when we are training. And if we're constantly going from one exercise to the next, there's just a big kind of time cost to that, to where doing a bunch of different exercises, you never kind of get in the groove of doing one exercise. It might make it actually harder to get a good kind of mind muscle connection there, because sometimes your mind muscle connection gets better for each set you do. And it's just a lot more time efficient. Now, could you do a different exercise for every single set of volume you do and still grow? Yeah, I think that you could. But I think that you definitely don't need to. And it's probably just going to add more time to your training. And it might make it more difficult to track progress because you're doing all these different exercises, and it might make it more difficult to add variations in the future, and it might make it hard to potentially get those benefits of maybe having a little bit novel stimulus from different exercises because you're already doing them all. So that's kind of why I would stay away from both those extremes. But I personally like about 2 to 5 sets per exercise. And I think that's kind of a nice middle ground of, hey, it's not on the far high end of like 7 or 8 sets, or on the low end of just one single set. All right. Question number 5, client can't lose fat, what to do? Well, if they're not losing body fat, then it could be a few things. It could be adherence. So I would have a open and honest communication with them, like, hey, how are we doing with adherence here? Maybe you check their MyFitnessPal to make sure that they are tracking stuff correctly. Like, I've definitely had examples of people that, for example, I have 100 grams of protein, and they will track a 50-gram chicken breast, a chicken breast that weighs 50 grams, as 50 grams of protein, which isn't the same thing. So make sure they're tracking things right and helping them out with that. Like, we're all start somewhere, and we all had to kind of go through that trial and error of learning how to track and stuff like that. So tracking their MyFitnessPal, making sure their adherence is on point, is the first place I'd look. And then if they're still not making progress after that, it's probably a matter of increasing the calorie deficit, either through reducing their energy consumption or the amount of food they're eating, or increasing their activity a little bit. All right. And depending on how they're feeling on their calories, or how much cardio they're already doing, or how much time they have, will kind of decide whether I add a little bit of activity or take away some food. Like, if they're already eating a very little amount of food, then I might add a little bit of activity, especially if they don't mind cardio and they have the time for it. But if they're totally strapped on time and they're eating enough, then I'll pull from that food a little bit more. All right. Question number 6, how to be a better coach. Well, I don't want to answer this and make it seem like I think I'm the best coach in the world or anything like that. But a few things that have definitely helped me is, for one, I think that you need a foundational understanding of like basic physiological kind of principles of muscle growth. Like, understanding the principles of how muscles actually grow is going to help you customize programs for each client that you have, rather than just giving clients template programs, not knowing what to do when you have these edge cases of different things going on. You can't just copy and paste stuff. Like, you have to know the foundational principles to be able to manipulate programs that is individualized for a client. So that is like step 1, foundational principles of muscle hypertrophy, fat loss, that sort of thing. Also, after you know those principles, I don't think going into the weeds of like physiological mechanisms is really going to help you be that much better of a coach. And I think that the best thing that you can do after understanding those kind of physiological principles is then understanding the principles of behavior change, of psychology, of communication. So you're better able to communicate with clients, to give them feedback, to understand where they're coming from, to help them change their behaviors that's going to help them lead to their results. So understanding the physiological principles is kind of the first place I would start. And then I would look towards behavior change, psychology, and that sort of thing, because I think that that plays a big role here. All right. Question number 7, metabolites in a cut. I don't think it's the best idea. I think that during a cutting phase, we're really just trying to maintain that muscle mass. To me, there's not a lot of upsides of playing with metabolites in the cutting phase when we can just do traditional training. And I do see downsides of it being more difficult to manage fatigue when doing metabolites and also combining that with a fat loss phase. So I'd stay away from metabolites in a cut. Number 8, wide grip bench press. Is it better for chest hypertrophy? And I think that your grip on the bench press is going to make a pretty trivial difference in the long run on overall chest hypertrophy. And assuming that you're still doing a few different exercises for your chest per week, I think it makes even less of a difference. And I think over the long run, if someone told me they used a wider grip versus a more narrow grip on the bench, I think over the course of 3 to 5 years, I wouldn't expect really any differences. Now, I would almost say that a more moderate grip to where you are making sure to use a full range of motion, your grip is comfortable for you, that would probably be a little bit better than a more kind of powerlifting style to where you really arch and you shorten that range of motion a little bit and you have a little less bar path there. But then again, if you look at powerlifters and stuff like that, they're usually hammering their chest with a ton of volume and stuff like that. And usually they're not lacking in the chest area for muscle growth. So I think that I wouldn't worry about your grip width a whole lot and would more so do what's comfortable, maybe leaning towards a more moderate grip with a nice longer range of motion. But I think either way is going to be pretty fine there. All right. Number 9, fixed versus auto-regulated mesocycles. So should you plan your deload or should you auto-regulate it for when you need it? Well, I think that in theory, auto-regulating your mesocycles actually makes more sense to where why would you do a deload when you don't necessarily need one? And why would you reduce that training stress when you don't have any indicators that that stress needs to be reduced? However, I think that in practice, it could be very easy to keep telling yourself that I don't need a deload, I can keep going here, and then you just run yourself into the ground. Or on the flip side, it could be like, I'm working really hard here, I need the deload, when maybe you actually could use a little bit more of an overreaching week and that sort of thing. And planning that deload ahead of time, it might help you kind of really push it in that last week because you know the deload's coming. And then it's also kind of a nice little backstop to keep you from running yourself into the ground. However, I'm more of a proponent of let's kind of plan the deload every 4 to 6 weeks. We want it to be in this range. But if we're progressing really well in that final week, things are going awesome, my client is feeling really good, then I'll keep that ball rolling and I'll ride that momentum for another week. But most of the times, I do kind of take it as planned. Unless things are just going kind of unexpectedly well, then we'll take it. But over time, after a few mesocycles of figuring out what a good accumulation length for someone is, usually that stays pretty similar each mesocycle. And we get in a nice kind of groove of an accumulation phase. All right. So I think theoretically, I think both approaches can absolutely work. I think theoretically, auto-regulating deloads actually might make a little bit more sense on paper. Practically, I think planning them out and expecting one every 4 to 6 weeks is a good approach, and then kind of using a combination of the two to where, hey, we think it's going to be every 4 to 6 weeks, but if things are going really well or we're feeling really good, we'll extend it a little bit, and vice versa. If things aren't feeling good and we feel overreached a little earlier, then we'll back off a little bit, we'll deload, and we'll adjust our next accumulation phase, all right? So that's it for questions. Stay tuned for the dad joke of the week, and I'll see you guys next Sunday.